Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name's of course Seesaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy XIV in 2020. Now, this is another MMO comparison video, and it's actually the most requested video I've had in the comment section for the past two comparison videos we've done, so I figured I may as well get right on it. But just before we do that, I wanted to give you guys all a huge shout out for the incredible support you've been giving these comparison videos. The last Guild Wars 2 versus Elder Scrolls Online video has passed 1,000 likes, which is insane. That's the most amount of likes any video I've ever made has received, and I can't thank you enough for it. If you could like this video and continue to support the channel, I'll continue to put out these kind of videos that you guys seem to love because I enjoy making them as well. So thank you very much. We also had a poll in the last video where I asked you guys your opinions about Guild Wars 2 and the Elder Scrolls Online in 2020, and I promised we would talk about the results, so here they are. At the moment, Guild Wars 2 seems to be the place to be in 2020. Of course, the poll will stay open and I will continue to update you guys if things change, so be sure to subscribe if you want to keep seeing polls like this in the future and the responses as well. That being said, there is a poll at the end of this video where you guys can give your own opinions about Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy XIV in 2020. Be sure to stay around and vote because I'd love to hear what you guys think about the two games. So this was a video that I was originally on the fence about creating, despite the fact that so many people wanted me to do it next. The main reason for this, and people who follow the channel regularly might have already figured this out, is hey, I'm only like partway through Final Fantasy XIV. Yes, I've been playing Final Fantasy XIV for 10 months now, so I have put a lot of hours into it, but I've been doing very much the slow and steady, enjoy the journey approach, which I've been very proud of. And originally I was thinking, hey, I should wait until, I'm fully throughout the game and have experienced a lot of different endgame activities to make a comparison, but number one, that's going to take forever until I get there. I'm sorry, that's the truth. And number two, I didn't want to feel rushed to get to those endgame, parts and rush through the other parts of my journey. So I really wanted to find a way that I could give my current view of both games, because I have played both games, and I think it is valuable to have a viewpoint from someone who is veteran in one game and newly experiencing a different game. I think that offers a bit of a different point of view, and it is valuable. I just want to be very upfront with it, that hey, I am a new player at Final Fantasy XIV, and I am more of a veteran at Guild Wars 2. So that's where this is coming from. With that in mind, I'm going to gear this comparison more towards the new player experience in both games. I am going to touch on some of the activities you can do at endgame, but I'm not going to get into some of the nitty-gritty that I wouldn't know until later on. And that being said, maybe later on, once I do have more knowledge of the Final Fantasy XIV endgame, maybe I'll make a second part to this comparison that will look at the two games endgame, and we'll go from there. But that's far in the future, and I just wanted to get that out there right away. But there we go. So we're going to do the comparison in a very similar way. We're going to start with these different sections. We're going to look at the new player experience. We're going to look at the leveling process. We're going to look at combat and classes. We're going to look at the story and exploration. We're going to look at endgame activities. And then finally, we're going to talk about the graphics of both games. If any veteran players of either game notices anything that I miss or has any additional information for any of the sections, please feel free to put that in the comments below, specifically for Final Fantasy XIV. I know there are things that I'll miss or things that I've overlooked, so do feel free to add that in the comments below. I always appreciate that, and I'm sure people who are looking to get into either of the games would appreciate that as well. But we're going to be talking about the new player experience and mostly the cost of actually trying out these games, because that's one of the biggest things that encourages me to try one MMO versus another, is how easy it is to actually get into the game. Now, Guild Wars 2, I've said this in the past couple videos, I say this in every video, it's probably the most generous business model of any of the big MMOs currently. You get the entire base game for free, which is an incredible amount of content. You can go all the way to max level. You can try out many of the different classes. You can try out many of the different open world bosses and different content types until you want to start doing some of the more expansion specific pieces of content, such as raids or strike missions, and trying out some of the new elite specializations. You really don't have to consider purchasing the game. But when you do consider purchasing the game, it's once again really easy. Just go ahead and buy the 2 expansions. I think they're usually bundled together for a decent price, which is pretty good, and you are done. You're caught up. That's it. There's no subscription fee, nothing else. There is a gem store that is typically quite focused on cosmetics. There's really nothing that's considered pay to win, though there is some pay for quality of life upgrades. These upgrades might include additional character slots, additional bank slots, and, different kind of boosters like that. So there is the option to do that, but it's nothing that I've ever felt I require. And in addition to that, you can convert in-game gold into the gem store currency, so you can realistically buy anything with in-game gold if you save it up and transfer it, which is a really nice system as well. Now, Final Fantasy XIV, on the other hand, is your traditional subscription-based MMO. Think World of Warcraft. You buy the different expansions, you buy the game, and you pay a monthly sub fee. Now, the big difference here versus World of Warcraft is that you can't even pay for the sub fee with in-game gold. This is kind of a negative for those who really don't want to pay the sub fee, but it is a positive for people who really don't want people to buy power with money. Let's be honest, in World of Warcraft, yes, you can't buy the absolute best drops in the game with money, but you can get a lot of really good BOEs from the auction house with a credit card if you wanted to. You could become quite powerful if you were so inclined. So it does make a really nice separation between what you're paying and the actual progress you receive in game, which I think is really good. The other really good thing is that it does have a pretty decent free trial period. Which is actually an unlimited time free trial. It just goes to a maximum level of 35, I believe, which allows you to try out a fair bit of the game. It allows you to explore a lot of the jobs and classes and get a good feel for what you might enjoy doing. You get to try out some dungeons and different pieces of content as well, so it gives you a good feel for what the game's going to be, though you don't get to experience max level character progression, which is something that you're going to have to either watch videos or just kind of imagine, unfortunately. So there is some drawbacks, but it is definitely worth checking out the free trial if you are interested in the game. So you've gone ahead and created your badass character, and you're ready to become an epic warlord in whatever game you chose to play. However, you have to level up first. Leveling up is one of the core mechanics found in most MMORPGs, and it's treated quite differently in Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy XIV respectively. In Guild Wars 2, exploration is truly the king. You can go really to any zone and start exploring the map, doing different challenges, visiting vistas, completing heart quests. There's really tons of activities for you to do, and it even gives you a fancy little map completion box if you're someone who likes to check things off. That being said, you're not really going to find a narrative that leads you to which zone you should go to next. There is a personal story that we'll talk about more in the next section, but it's not necessarily designed for leveling as much as it is to give your character a bit of backstory. The true advantage to Guild Wars 2's leveling system is the ability to level anywhere and play with different friends while you're leveling. You can meet up with someone who's already level 80 or just leveling at a different pace than you and complete different zones together. You can also, of course, do instance content such as dungeons, which can be quite fun to explore and also quite rewarding when you do complete them. Overall, there is a lot to do, but you kind of have to be your own guide when leveling in Guild Wars 2, which is something that some people find difficult, but some people absolutely love. Then there's leveling in Final Fantasy XIV, and if you're someone who's been along for my very lengthy playthrough sessions, you'll know that it can take quite a while, specifically if you're focused on the story. However, we're going to separate the story and talk about that in a later section and just focus on leveling. Now, there are lots of ways to get experience in Final Fantasy XIV, so you can actually switch it up, which is quite nice, and do different things for different levels and for different jobs. That is one point I guess we should discuss real quickly, is that you have you have one character and you can have multiple different jobs on that character, which is quite different than most MMOs. So you could make a character who is a bard, which is kind of Final Fantasy XIV's archer class, or is what the archer becomes, and you could bring that all the way to max level. Then you could, on that same character, become a scholar, which you would then need to bring all the way to max level as well. So it's kind of a situation where if you want to have multiple jobs, you'll have to level your character multiple times. Now, there is a really nice effect where if you are working on a job that is a lower level than your current main job, and your main job's high enough, you'll get bonus experience on those lower level jobs. So it's actually really kind of an alt-friendly game, despite the fact that you're not actually making alt characters in a traditional sense. It's a little bit confusing to wrap your head around, but I figured I'd just toss that side point in as well. In terms of the actual leveling though, there are lots of ways you can do it. You can do main scenario quests, which are the story quests that we'll talk about in a second, and they do give you some experience, but maybe not the best experience. There are side quests that you'll run into all around the world, and then there are instant pieces of content, such as dungeons, trials, raids, guild hests, which hopefully I'm still saying correctly, but those are kind of a dungeon mixed with a tutorial that teach you some important game mechanics. They're quite important for new players, but they actually do give a nice bit of experience the first time you do them, and I believe there is a daily roulette for them as well. Daily roulettes are your typical, daily first dungeon of the day kind of bonus experience that you get. But there is one for different types of content as well, so there are a few different ones for you to do each day. And if you're just a casual leveler who wants to get the most experience for the littlest time put in, those daily roulettes are probably the way to go about it. There are other ways to level as well, such as exploring and killing different creatures on your different jobs. There's sort of a task list where you have to kill specific creatures. There are different daily quests and daily leaves you can do in different zones, and then there is the Palace of the Dead, which is a very unique feature to Final Fantasy XIV, but it's kind of like a dungeon, but you can also do it solo or with 4 players, and you go through it and it scales in difficulty, and you get different abilities as you go up through the floors, and you can use that as a good way to get experience for the job that you're playing as. So it's a pretty cool way to level up if you're someone who is, just trying to level and not as focused on doing the story quests, which as a new player might not be you, but as someone who is leveling up a different job, that might be something you're more focused on. So I think I touched on a lot of different ways to level. There is probably still a ton more that I've forgotten and will be added in the comments below. But long story short, it's more traditional leveling where you have instant content that you can go into, or a narrative that you can follow, and less of an exploration, such as Guild Wars 2. Alright, so combat has turned into combat and classes for this comparison. It was a suggestion someone made in the comments of the last video, and I thought, hey, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about the different way that these two games handle these systems. As we have in the other sections, we'll start with Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 has very distinct classes, but perhaps less distinct than Final Fantasy XIV in terms of their role. So you can build classes to be tanky or squishy or more healy, but there's kind of a broad spectrum of where you lay, and it gets a little bit more confusing when you're trying to play a specific role maybe for a raid or a strike mission, whereas for open world stuff you can probably, just do these custom builds that you really enjoy and no one's really going to care. The actual classes themselves feel quite unique from each other, and with each expansion they get a new elite spec that gives quite a different playstyle to the class. For instance, Thieves, which typically use dagger, but there's a lot of other weapons they can use, got introduced a staff in Heart of Thorns and a rifle in the Path of Fire. Two very different weapons for the class that play extremely different from one another and extremely different from the core class itself. So there are a lot of different things that get added with each expansion, and that's one of the biggest, most exciting pieces for future expansions, is to see what new weapon or what new abilities your class will get, which is really cool. The tricky part and the downside, I'd say, was once again, if you're trying to play very specific role-centric content, such as strike missions and raids, there typically tends to be metas that reduce the amount of roles that will play a certain, or amount of classes that will play a certain role. For instance, when raids were initially introduced way back when, pretty much the only tank you would ever see would be a Mesmer, which was a really cool tank because, they got the shield, they got the sword, they got to do this cool buff rotation, which was great. But my friends who usually play tanks absolutely hated the fact that the primary tank that you could play was a cloth-wearing mystical mage. So there are issues like that you run into. The game is, always trying to add new balance and have different classes acceptable for different roles, and this is something that has improved as time has gone on. There are different ways you could play as a tank now, for instance, and there are also different ways you could play as a healer as opposed to just running a druid. So there are some strides in the right direction, though I'd say if you are a group that is focused on meta, you might still find yourself running the same classes over and over again, which kind of ruins the grand plan of having all of these different cool builds. But that's just the way the cookie crumbles for that. And then we get into the jobs in Final Fantasy XIV, which are very distinctly set up in roles. And there's quite a lot of them, but you have the three typical roles of tank, healer, and DPS, where you have a holy trinity that you would be used to in other games such as World of Warcraft. So it makes a lot more sense where you're going to play each of these specific classes, and because they are more easily defined in these different roles, you're not going to have situations where a class isn't taken. Though, once again, for absolute speed clears or the most challenging content, there might be classes that are favored over other classes. That's just how the cookie's going to crumble. The one really nice thing that Final Fantasy XIV does is they do have kind of a story quest associated with each job that you play as well, which as a new player for Final Fantasy XIV seemed like a lot because there was already so much story quest going on. But now looking back at it, it's added so much flavor to the class that I'm playing, and it's really helped me identify with that class. Like I through and through feel like I'm playing a different class when I switch over and start doing now different quests with different characters and different lore for a different class or job, as they call it. So it is really nice that way, and it's something that I do wish Guild Wars 2 had more of. Guild Wars 2 does have sort of a collection system with each of the specialized classes that unlock sort of an ultimate weapon, which is kind of cool. And there are different sort of challenges with the classes themselves, but the absolute lore and implementation of story could make them so much more than they currently are. As for the combat itself, this is a pretty easy comparison to make, as both games have very different combat systems. Final Fantasy XIV, as you've probably seen in the background footage, has a very traditional tab targeting combat system that you'll be familiar with a lot of older tab targeting games. It is known to be a little bit slower than some games, though it does feel better once you get more skills, specifically in your end game. Your job tends to have a nice fluid sort of rotation that feels good with a lot of different abilities. There are also some really nice flashy skills that look really good and feel quite impactful when used. As for Guild Wars 2, we have more of an action-based combat. A lot of people like to say it's a cross between action combat and tab targeting, with some skills actually locking on to enemies and some skills not. It does feel quite unique to itself, and I actually really enjoy the combat system. It has a lot of little things you need to learn about it though, so it's a little bit trickier for newer players, specifically learning how certain class abilities will synergize with other class abilities. It does feel quite nice when you do figure everything out. Alrighty, so let's now talk about story and how it's handled in these two different games. Guild Wars 2 has had a very interesting take on story that has shifted a lot throughout the years. When it first released, it had a personal story that was an alright story, but was very clunky in the way it was delivered, and often feels pretty boring because of the amount of clunky sort of cutscenes slash chat boxes you have to go through to receive any of the narrative. The one really nice thing is that it does have a story that extends both your player's background as well as your race's background, and really tells a bit of sort of background lore for you, which I think is really enjoyable. It also sort of pushes you throughout the world, exploring some different zones, and gives you kind of a grand explanation of the new world of Guild Wars 2 and who the main baddies are, which are Elder Dragons. So it does a few things right, but it feels pretty clunky. They then switched to this living story situation, which was interesting because it offered story, but the downside for Season 1 was that the story was gone once it was gone. It was a cool system, but a lot of people are pretty sad that the content was gone, and it's actually something that many years now have passed, and they are finally bringing back Season 1 story content for people to enjoy now. It was kind of this weird situation where it felt very cool and authentic because you had to be there for the story, but later I think they realized that, hey, we're creating content just to remove the content, so that doesn't make much sense. They did fall into a very good story system now, where you do have living world content between each of the major expansions, and as long as you log in during an episode of the living world, you get to claim that as a free piece of content with the expansion, which is a pretty cool system and a pretty generous window, because typically you have between 2 and 4 months between each of these episodes. The way they deliver the story has also become a lot better, where you'll have characters who kind of talk while you're actually playing the game, and it feels very organic the way you walk through an instance and get story told to you. Now, Final Fantasy XIV Story is also a fun time. However, if you are someone who's considered playing Final Fantasy XIV, or maybe you've gotten into the game recently yourself, you'll know that it has a bit of a reputation for being quite a tedious journey. And the main reason for this is that you do have to progress through the story to progress through the rest of the game, which can take some time. It's even gotten to the point where there is a way to skip the story that you can purchase from the game, but we're not going to get into whether or not that's good for the game or a good decision to make. That's not the point of this video, but it is just something to be aware of. The story itself, although tedious at parts, specifically early on, does develop a lot of characters and is interesting in other parts. The way I put it in a past video is that there are highs and lows in the story, and because the fact that there are lows, it makes the highs feel that much higher. If it was a story that was just high intensity the whole time, it would, not play as organically. It wouldn't make sense to a real life scenario. But there you have it. It is a bit tedious, and it is, in the Final Fantasy world. I'm someone who never played a Final Fantasy game before, and one of the main concerns I had coming to Final Fantasy XIV is that maybe the story wouldn't resonate with me because I don't have that background of the world of Final Fantasy. And there are certain things that I'm sure would be more impactful to someone who did have past experience of, other games, and certain characters that I might be more excited to meet. But overall, I've really enjoyed the journey, and I feel like it's been one of the better MMO stories I've played, and that's just playing through the Realm Reborn section. Most people will tell you, and I hopefully will later confirm, that playing through the expansion stories only gets better, and the most recent expansion, Shadowbringers, is supposed to have an incredible story as well, that's built on some lore that is established in earlier stories. So it's really good to pay attention early on to be rewarded later in the later expansion stories. But there you have it. It's not for everyone. Some people hate it. I have some friends that I wouldn't be able to drag through the story, and I have some people who probably would love to sit down and just, really take in a very long and detailed story as well. So it's, it's for different players for sure. All right, so the next section is endgame activities and character progression. Now, I'm going to do this comparison in broad strokes because, once again, I have much more experience with Guild Wars 2's endgame content than I do in Final Fantasy XIV, and there's a lot of other content creators that have more detailed explanations of Final Fantasy's endgame and different guides if you are into that kind of stuff. When I do have more knowledge, I'll be happy to fill you in as well. But let's get to it. Broad stroke wise, Guild Wars 2, you're looking at horizontal progression, which means the level cap and the item level of gear typically stay the same. The way your character increases in strength is that you get, different unique features or abilities. These have often been like gliding or mounts or different ways of jumping off magical mushrooms, those kind of things. And it's very exciting to guess what the newest feature will be in the next expansion, but that's kind of a video for another day as well. Whereas Final Fantasy XIV, you have your typical vertical progression, where with different releases, you'll have new tiers of raid, new tiers of armor, an item level that increases. Each expansion typically brings a higher level cap as well, where you'll become much stronger than you were in the past. It is a game that's very traditional in that sense. There are some catch-up mechanics, but it is a game that if you took a break for an extended period of time, you are more than likely going to have to do a little bit of catch-up to be able to play the most recent pieces of content. Whereas Guild Wars 2, you can drop off the face of the earth for a while and then pop right back into a raid, and you might have to dust off the old build and rotation, but your gear should be good to go. So then we have our different endgame activities. For Guild Wars 2, you have your 3 typical pillars of content. You have PvE that focuses on fractals, raids, strike missions, which are probably the most prominent new piece of content that you'll be seeing for group instance content, that is. You have open world exploration and the new maps that are released and world bosses. You also have structured PvP, one of the other pillars, that focuses on more arena-style battles with either 2v2 deathmatch or 5v5 domination games. And then you have World v World v World, which is your large-scale PvP battles with castles and sieging and zergs and all that fun stuff. It's a good time. And then for Final Fantasy's endgame activities, which once again, I don't have a ton of knowledge of, they do have PvE and PvP content, though there is a much bigger focus on PvE content. They're well known for making really great dungeons and raids, the raids having multiple different styles and different difficulty levels to them, which is really good for both casual players who aren't able to devote as much time, as well as hardcore players that are looking for a true challenge at endgame, which is really nice. And you just get a tremendous amount more content really compared to a game such as Guild Wars 2, and it makes a lot of sense when you look at the fact that you're paying a fair bit more for this game as well, with the monthly subscription and the actual buying of the game on top of that. So there is a lot more content if you are someone who's looking to invest a bit more time into a game, but also have a lot more to do in a game as well. So it's kind of a cost-based decision as well. And that brings us to our final and quickest section of the comparison, which is graphics. This one's a little bit tricky because it is such a subjective comparison. Typically, I'd say Guild Wars 2 has more of a painted art style. It looks a bit dated in some regards. It is probably less optimized in terms of getting that frame rate per second and stuff like that you're going to want, whereas Final Fantasy XIV, I'm able to hit those higher frame rates, which is quite nice and it's a bit more fluid that way, a little bit less clunky, I'd say. Guild Wars 2 does have some incredibly stunning environments, as well as their mounts are quite beautiful as well. And then there's obviously legendary gear that is quite stunning. Even many years from when they've been created, looking back at some of the first legendaries such as Sunrise and Eternity, the amount of detail and artistic creativity that went into these pieces of gear tend to not be rivaled by many games. They are just such beautiful pieces, and for a lot of people, like, the main reason they're playing is to have and unlock these pieces of gear that are super cool. Final Fantasy XIV has a lot of beauty in it. The world feels rich. The world feels very well put together with really nice ambient music. There's a lot of little details in terms of making your character feel like they're a part of the game. I know it's not necessarily graphics, but for instance, you can go to an inn, you can go and tuck yourself into bed, log off, and then log back in and you're crawling out of bed. It's little things like that that make the game feel so special. Speaking of inns, there's also a fun little story journal that shares all of the cutscenes, which is nice to catch you up on the story, and does get you to play back some of the cooler cutscenes that have had more work put into them, which is nice as well. In terms of other artistic endeavors, some of the cities are extremely impressive. There's a lot of really nice lighting and kind of crystal styles, and more of an anime feel of some of the costumes you're going to get as well that you don't get in a lot of other Western MMOs, right? So there is a bit of a distinction that way, which is nice, and it even traverses to some of the enemies and some of the main characters in the game that you'll see as well. So there is a pretty big distinction in art style that you'll feel. And I guess flashiness as well, though both games do have quite flashy skill animations when you have a bunch of people stuck on top of each other. All right, there we go. That is my comparison between the two games. I know I've already talked for a tremendously long amount of time, but I'm sure I did miss a bunch of stuff. If I did miss stuff, please mention it in the comments below. If you're a veteran of one game versus the other, specifically for Final Fantasy XIV, there's obviously sections I don't know as much about, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts about it. But speaking of that, this is the time in the video that you can cast your own vote. So you decide, Guild Wars 2 or Final Fantasy XIV, which game should new players get into in 2020? And be sure to subscribe, because we will talk about the results of this poll in a future comparison video. But yeah, guys, thank you for watching. If there is a future comparison video that you want to see created, please list it in the comments below, and I do take suggestions like that. So thank you once again for taking the time to watch this, and I'll see you in the next video.